morning, everyone. Welcome to SEMA 2024 SEMA. My name is Luis Martinez. I'm with iCar, and we have Brian Brown from AkzoNobel today. What do you got for us today, Brian?
Yeah, thank you. So what we want to talk about today is just a little bit on new color awareness and some of the technology and trends we see with where colors are going, and a couple easy steps on working with radar. So one of the important things I think to kind of note is where we started and kind of how we got to where we're at now. And if you look at where mixing machines kind of started and color complexity, it really was a lot different than it is today. If you look back, I remember a time when there was just three standard pearl toners on a mixing machine.
Exactly.
And you didn't have the amount of metallics. It wasn't a lot of different things. And so how we started to repair cars kind of formed in those years, but it's changed a whole lot since then.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to notice, you went from a mixing machine with 42, 45, 46 toners, and now it's well over 100.
I remember those days.
Yeah.
That picture brings back a lot of memories.
Some good, some bad.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you look at kind of how colors have advanced today, there's a lot of different things that we're seeing, right? You're seeing more and more like glass pigments, color shifting pigments are being used. At one time, we had a lot of color shifting pigments that were just kind of put on the car by themselves, but they're now actually part of color formulas more and more. You got some very highly chromatic pigments you see on these reds and blue colors in order to get a lot of depth.
Right.
Yeah, and so we can kind of replicate what we would typically call like a candy finish or whatnot, but it's actually just a standard kind of refinish system now.
I see.
Yep. You see more and more kind of like nano-gride pigments to get some of these chromatic colors. They're structural colors. We had one on a Lexus that was quite a bit different of a blue color. So quite a bit of change there. And so if you see some of these things, one thing to keep in mind with any of these colors is, complexity of them, it has gone up. Some of them require specific mixing instructions or
Prep instructions, special prepping.
definitely prep, yes.
Yeah.
It's some of them the way they sit into a scratch is different, so we have to prep them differently. We may have to apply them differently. It's not that they're hard, but we have kind of a set of rules for certain colors now that we have to follow, where before we just kind of sprayed everything the same way.
Right.
And so that's been a big departure and something that we're having to work with technicians every day to make sure that they have kind of the knowledge they need.
Correct.
They know what steps they need. And we're going to talk about some of those colors and what there are coming up here. So we kind of talked about the highly chromatic colors. We see this trend continuing to go on.
Right.
You're starting to see some of the reds move to a little bit darker of a shade. As we can get more and more chromatic colors and have them cleaner, they've seen a definite increase in sales, and it's really driving consumers to purchase cars made with these colors. So we've seen that they're getting cleaner and cleaner and more chromatic.
More chromatic, yes.
Yeah. Like I said, we use kind of like a nano grind technology to where we can get a color to look like a candy, like a dye, but we're using pigmentation, so it's very durable now too. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in that manner.
So does that takes away from the 3-stage, or is it still a 3-stage? Is it considered a 3-stage?
So it depends on the color, and what we've seen with some of these newer pigmentation is that colors that are very chromatic we can do in a 2-stage formula sometimes. Some of them may need a third layer just for a little bit more depth. But we're also able to formulate them now to where our ground layer is closer to the final result, which makes it better for the technician when they have to do repairs on them. If you remember back some of the old red colors where you had like a salmon or silver color under a red,
right,
and it made it really tough to do.
Exactly, yes.
Another trend we see is leafing aluminums. Right?
I have a big question about this because it was really difficult for me because I never heard that word, lifting.
Yeah. So we use it as a general term. I think everyone has a trade name. Our toner is called Argentum.
Okay.
Other manufacturers have a different name for it, but it's kind of the same thing. It's a silver pigment that instead of just spraying on there and it forms like a sparkle, it's actually made to form like a platelet layer on the surface and have more of a metal-like effect. And we've seen it come into cars like a Mercedes Alubeam Silver, or the Nissan GTR had one with it, but we're starting to see more and more use just in standard color formulas. Right.
Okay.
We saw a lot of wheels that were made that had this color on there. It's called like hyper silver.
Okay.
We're starting to see an uptick in it getting used and see a trend of more and more fine kind of metallic finishes, but they're still brilliant. So it's kind of a neat feature where typically smaller metallics had a little bit of a dirtier appearance. This allows you to have a nice clean look
Okay.
and a nice kind of satin luster type finish.
Now, these colors with the leafing, do they need like extra steps when you're prepping them?
Very good question. Yes. So since they're leafing and they want to form like a metal like layer, the prep has to be a little bit more precise, usually a little bit finer of a sand scratch. It may be a specific type of sandpaper to be used on there to where you make sure you don't have any kind of like loose random scratches that are overly deep, because it will show through in the final finish.
So when you punch in the code, let's say the Mazda
Yeah.
that has this, does it pop up and flashes that it needs special prepping or special steps or special way of prepping, getting your gun set up?
So what you'll usually see on some of these is whenever someone goes through a training course, we make sure we identify that these toners are different. But a lot of the colors will have a specific, like a technical service bulletin on that color, because it may not just be the prep. It may be certain mixing instructions are different, and there could be numerous things depending on the color. So it's a very good point, though. I think another good one to point out is like Mazda has a new white 3-stage. Instead of a 3-stage pearl, it's a 3-stage metallic.
Metallic.
Yeah, so it's quite a bit different. It has a different look to it. It's got a special process, and every manufacturer kind of uses something a little bit different but very similar.
Okay.
And it's not a hard process at all. I think the biggest thing to note is it's just different.
Okay.
And so kind of what we always want to recommend is making sure they're getting their technical service bulletin and making sure you read through it, highlight any areas that you may have questions on or maybe sound different, and spend some time going through it. And also, if it's a new color and you've never done it before, it's always best to take a scrap panel maybe and get it sprayed on there and do a repair just to understand where it's going.
Okay.
Like I said, not a hard color, but it's different.
Okay. That's nice.
And so, it's if you're not familiar with them, it's kind of goes back to the point of making sure we're going to training courses and staying up to date on these. It's just we're seeing more of a trend in these type of colors come up.
Oh, I see. So no drop code. No, I mean, no, not drop code. No test panels. No.
You definitely want to do test panels,
Okay.
yeah. And so we generally recommend kind of do a range of them, and it's kind of neat. You use more of like an over-reduced mid layer on these, so it actually dries pretty quick. And since it's metallic, you see a very drastic color change between coats, more so than you will with like just a pearl.
I see.
So-
Very good.
Yeah, it's a pretty neat color, but it's not difficult. Just have to be aware of it.
I see.
And so with that, we want to kind of go into working with radar, right, as well, because as color trends change, how we interact with the radar and ADAS systems on cars, this will have some effect on it. And so we try to put this in just a couple of steps here to make it easier for people or more digestible. Is when I walk away, these are some things that I need to do, right? And so if we look at how this works is the substrate thickness plays a part in how radar works. How much primer's on that part, how much can we put on there. One of the biggest influences is actually color and base coat. And so when I look at this thing, solid colors will have a little bit less of a impact on transmission, but they will have some. But when you start getting into some of these effect toners and these different appearances, it has more of an impact on how radar transmits through that paint film, especially with like the leafing aluminums where they're forming a very fine layer. It's a lot harder for the radar to transfer through this.
To go through it. I see.
So we're seeing more and more colors being formulated with them. But now with the rise of ADAS radar systems, it has a big impact on that. So it's something we have to be very cognizant of when we're doing a repair.
Especially 3 stages, I would think.
Exactly, yeah. And with that being said, pearls and Zerilux will have an effect on it too. Everything plays a part. Even clear coat layer thickness will play a part.
Right. All the thickness.
Yeah. And so one of the things we always want to make sure we do is look at, we're pulling OEM information because we have colors that are on cars and they can go through several makes and models, multiple model years, and you'll have some models that are affected with radar ADAS and some that won't be. So it's not just good enough to pull a paint code and see if it is maybe like a radar transparent formula. You really need to know that specific make and model, what needs to be done with it. And so you have OEM portals that you can go to, access the information. Different examples, we work with all the OEMs, not only in making sure that our color formulas are where they need to be or what the requirements are, but if there's anything we can do to kind of assist them, and also make it easier for our customers. We try and be as helpful as we can in all sides of that repair process.
So with radar, do you follow the manufacturer's recommendations, or would you follow, as a technician, would you follow the paint manufacturer recommendations when you're repairing a bumper, or when you're refinishing a bumper?
So it's a very good question. I think first off, you have to start with the OEM. The OEM won't really necessarily tell you how to refinish it, but they'll put rules around, what colors can be done, how many times you can refinish the part. So you have to know the OEM stance first, and then you want to make sure you follow the paint manufacturer's recommendations on how to apply all the coatings.
Very
so it's
nice.
really using both of them.
Okay, very nice.
And so I think kind of, step one is accessing the OEM information. You have to start there, making sure you're trained on how to use the product. I think step two is proper planning. And this is where we see it kind of falling off, because every shop now is doing a good job of doing repair planning, making sure they have a procedure for how to run that car through the collision repair process. Where we see it kind of lack sometimes is getting the paint department involved early enough, because if there is a special procedure on this car or vehicle, we need to make sure that the paint technicians are all aware of it,
Right.
and that we've all had the conversation on this is the best way to do this. Here's how we need to process the car through the repair.
Correct.
That's a
yes.
very, very critical part of that.
I agree.
And so, you have to investigate the color code. You have to investigate the procedures. Do
Yeah.
I need to do spray outs? Do I need to?
If you need special tints, toners.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. As we mentioned, some of these more exotic colors or new pigments out there, you may not necessarily stock them in the shop because they could be low use.
Right, right.
But I want to make sure I have enough time to make sure I get it in and I don't delay the repair.
Correct.
I think the third part there is kind of step three is, my repair considerations. How do I handle the repair in the radar zone? And there's a couple things. And I mean, first off, you want to follow the OEM recommendation. That's really the important thing to remember. But there's several things. It's kind of like universal. Like we can't put body filler or repair materials inside of that radar zone. I don't know anyone that actually recommends that. You can't use any kind of like welding staples or anything like that. You have to be very careful on how much material you remove just from the part.
Correct.
Right? So it's not just I can grind a deep scratch down.
Prime it away.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. And I got to be careful on how much primer I put on as well.
Yep.
And so these are all things that, are always kind of a universal truth. And another big one is blending in a radar zone. All right? So if I look at this graphic here, I can kind of see on one side, I've got to make sure that my repair, both the base coat and clear coat, completely cover that radar zone.
Right.
I can't blend base coat and I can't blend clear coat. So the tough part of that is a lot of times these radar zones are on the edges or corners of the bumper. So as a technician, where's the most likely spot you want to do a blend?
At the end of the bumpers.
Exactly. It makes it easiest. We
Right.
can kind of lose it around the corner.
Right.
So that makes repairs a little bit trickier because we have to have planning. And this is where it really goes back to that step of repair planning, that I know what I have to do. I know I can't blend in this zone. So me and the estimator in the shop, we all need to have a conversation on what's the best way to process this car through here, because it may take, maybe I have to blend an adjacent panel,
Correct.
maybe I have to approach the repair a little bit differently, or maybe keep it smaller. So
Yeah.
a lot of considerations.
I see. I can see that.
I think the other thing is like, how do I handle, color in the radar zone? And I think we touched on this earlier, but to kind of expand on it, if I have a radar zone I've got to put paint in, and I've got a color that requires a radar transparent formula, I'm not allowed to tint or adjust that color at all.
So what do you recommend in those cases?
So the first thing is you got to start with the spray out and see where the color lies. You may have no issue whatsoever, but you are limited sometimes on the aluminum content of that formula.
Right.
And so there's only so much you can put in there. So there's other things that are added to try and get the color as close as it can be. But you might find that you actually have to do some additional blending just to get this repair done.
Right.
Depends on where it's at in the radar zone, how close the other panel is, and what the color looks like. But that's going to be the trickiest part.
Right.
Now we're doing a lot of work on the back end to have more of a predictive model so that maybe an adjustment could be made. But that's still something that's in process. It has to be fully vetted by all the OEMs, have approval by them that it's something that they want to do. So we don't have it right now, but I think everyone's working on that, and I think that's a good next step. We'll also see how cars are designed and where the radar zones go,
Right.
of how this kind of rolls out. But I mean, right now, it's the situation we have. and it's kind of what we all have to deal with.
Right.
So another thing is it's really important to note that the reason we don't want to adjust these colors is whenever we have one, kind of the way the process works is any of the formulas that we deem is a radar transparent, we've already done the work, we've done the testing to make sure they have the proper transmission to the paint layer, and they've all been signed off by the OEMs on there too.
Okay.
So that's an important process that we're all working with the OEMs in conjunction to make sure that, this is the formula, we know it's good, we know it won't impact the repair, follow our refinish procedures with it, and you should be good to go.
So go back to the basics, basically. Go check the technical sheet, make sure everything's right.
Exactly. Very good point. A couple other considerations is just on the different processes, and this is, we can talk for the next hour on some of these things, but I think most important thing to know is how every OEM approaches it can be slightly different. So really the main point is that just because I did it this way on one make and model doesn't mean I do it on every make and model this way. So it's really important. Sometimes you may be removing the coating down to raw plastic. Sometimes it may be a parts replacement. It's going to be different from everyone, right? So we got to make sure we stay on top of that and always be using the most up-to-date information.
Information, correct.
Yeah. And that's really it. To wrap it up, I mean, I think it's a very in-depth topic, but we would try to give enough information today to where people have something to take away from and say, these are some of the trends we're seeing, and here's a couple steps I can take that really get me on the way to processing the car properly with repair.
Absolutely.
Radar.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.